All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Alden Kindred's presentation of Mayflower Day by Day. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs, genealogical research, and exhibitions. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our members who are joining us today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. Today, we're so very honored to welcome Becket Soule, whose deep scholarship offers some fresh insight into this Pilgrim story. His new book, Mayflower Day by Day, offers a very richly detailed account of the journey from Holland in the summer of 1620 through the return of the Fortune in December of 1621. Drawing on a variety of sources, original and more recent, Becket digs into the details of this story, the experiences of that first year, and why Plymouth Colony ultimately failed. Becket Soule is a professor of canon law at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., where he's joining us today, is a descendant of 18 Mayflower passengers, including two of our favorites, John and Priscilla Alden, and a former governor of the North Carolina Mayflower Society. His recent publications, all with heritage books, include a centennial history, North Carolina Society, a study of the passengers on the Fortune, and forthcoming genealogical studies of George Soule and Philip Delano and their descendants. After this talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the chat or the question and answer function. And a recording of this program will be posted on the Alden website at alden.org. And now let's welcome Becket Soule. Becket, thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. It's really great to be here on a wonderful pre-Thanksgiving day and to talk about Mayflower Day by Day. So perhaps just initially a couple of words on what started this all off. So the planning for the 400th anniversary had been going on for well over a decade. But as undoubtedly all of you know, and 2020 came and went, and it didn't happen the way that it was planned. And looking at all of the things that were being presented, a lot of them online, it struck me that very few of them actually talked about the Mayflower. And they were talking about other things and other people. And that got me started on this so that um, the idea of the journey was one of the main things. And so that's how I'm going to start. And I'm going to deal with a couple of other topics that came out of uh, posting on this every day for about a year and a half. One are the calendar issues that were there. Another that I still have not really come up with an answer is the Mayflower Compact. Not so much those who signed it, but perhaps more importantly, those who didn't sign it. What happened to them? What were they? Uh, what was their story? And coming up with the drama of so many of the things that were there, trying to put ourselves into what was happening in Plymouth and ultimately in a number of other places, uh, that the emotional force of what was happening is really remarkable. And then finally, I think one of the particular questions that I was looking at towards the end of this whole process is this is one of the two colonies in New England that ultimately fail. So why was that? And so I'm going to try and deal with those uh, as the topics this afternoon. The first post that I did was for the events of Friday, the 24th of July, 1620, which is when the Leiden pilgrims uh, left Leiden, and the and when the Mayflower left London in order to meet them on the south coast of England. And I finished on Thursday, the 23rd of December in or 1621. The I think this is unusual. I'll talk more about other calendar things later on, but what was unusual is that the day of the week was the same for 1620 and 2020. So the 24th of July in 1620 was a Friday, and the 24th of July in 2020 was also a Friday. So I thought that was a nice added bonus. Well, one of the things that really drove this whole thing was to follow the pilgrims on their journey. It's one thing to say that they were more than 60 days on the Mayflower as they were crossing the Atlantic. It's another thing to spend more than 60 days reading about where they were. And I think that is really giving you a sense of how long that was as they're all cooped into this relatively small and certainly crowded ship. But the other thing is so many other uh, results of that have come down to us through genealogical research. And I think two of the things in genealogical research that are uh, perhaps interesting, not so much vital, but certainly interesting, is on the Mayflower descendants themselves. One of the things, of course, is intermarriage. And the other thing is how many generations is it? Because each generation going to be uh, is going to be what is responsible for handing the story down to the next. So the first has to do with the marriages or intermarriages. And here I think there are some interesting numbers. So in the Mayflower passengers, and I'm calling that in this chart here, generation zero, there were 27 marriages that produced children. And of that, 60% were marriages in which both people were Mayflower passengers, and 40%, 11, were those in which there was a Mayflower passenger who married somebody who was not a Mayflower passenger, obviously later than 1620. And so uh, that is the um, that is the generation of the Mayflower passengers themselves. The next generation, when you're talking about the children of Mayflower passengers, there are 81 marriages that produce children. Of those, 11 marriages are between people both of whose parents were Mayflower passengers, and 70 are between people, one of whom is a Mayflower, one of whose parents is a Mayflower passenger, and the other spouse, the parent is not. So that's 14%. And that is to some extent the lowest because each subsequent generation, that percentage increases. So in the second generation, what you get is 450 marriages produced children. And these are people whose grandparents were Mayflower passengers. Of that, 96 had both spouses had Mayflower grandparents, and 354 did not. So the gene pool is being broadened, but the number of Mayflower marriages is also increasing, and that I think is rather interesting because it's as the number of marriageable Mayflower descendants increases, you find the percentage. So that, for example, looking the three families that I'm currently working on, the Soule descendants and the Delano descendants, Delano coming on the fortune in 1621, and Abraham Sampson. So Henry Sampson was on the Mayflower, but his cousin, his first cousin, Abraham, was not. But of these, 40% of the descendants are the same in the fourth generation. 60% of them are the same in the sixth generation. So that the intermarriage increases as time goes on. That also means that writing uh, genealogical sketches for these becomes easier because a lot of it is going to be cut and paste. But when you're talking about generations, I think it's also important to realize that that does not necessarily mean a certain number of years. So looking just simply at the George Soule descendants and who is the earliest birth in each generation and who is the latest death. So there is the modern marker in Duxbury at the Miles Standish Cemetery that's there on the left. But that's George Soule. Mary Becket was her maiden name, died a few years before he did, before George did. So he died in 1680, between 1679 or 1680. We don't have an exact date. It was in January of that year. And his wife had died a year or two beforehand. And the earliest birth in the next generation, these are the children of George Soule. The earliest birth is about 1627, and that's Zachariah Soule. And the latest death, the last of the children to die of George Soule, is Mary Soule Peterson, who died in 1718. So almost 100 years after the Mayflower. In the third generation, these are the grandchildren of George Soule and Mary Becket. The earliest birth is 1657, and that's Rebecca Soule Weston. And the latest death of is Sarah Soule Wheaton, and she died in 1771. So you now see that there is a full century in between the earliest and the latest death. In the fourth generation, the earliest birth is 1680. Esther Wright Pratt is her married name. She's born in 1680, so not long after the death of Pilgrim George Soule. The last death in the fourth generation is in 1822. And then it continues. In the fifth generation, the earliest birth is 1701, Joshua Pratt. And the latest death is 1871. In the sixth generation, the earliest birth is James Dunham, born in 1723. And the latest death is 1908. That's the sixth generation, but we're into the 20th century. In the seventh generation, the earliest birth is 1744, Benjamin Ward, and the latest death is 1951 with George Pearson. And the eighth generation, which is as far as I'm going in the the book of Soule Descendants, the earliest birth in the eighth generation is 1773. That's the eighth generation. And the latest death that I've come up with is 1989. So when many of us were alive, uh, the there may be an earlier birth than 1773, but because my work on the eighth generation is not yet complete, I'm not really doing much on the ninth generation, but I have a suspicion that there is a possibility that somebody in the ninth generation may still be alive uh, today. So when we talk about a generation, typically we're talking about, perhaps 25 years, but realize that a lot can change. Certainly by the end, by the eighth generation, you've got a 200-year gap between the earliest birth and the latest death. That also brings up the whole question of the calendar. One of the things I decided at the very beginning is that I was going to use the equivalent in the Gregorian calendar, because I wanted to say this is what happened exactly 400 years ago today. Now, that requires a certain amount of explanation. The Julian calendar is a solar calendar of 365 days in each year, with an additional leap day every fourth year, and that is without exception. It was proposed in 46 BC by, and it takes its name from, Julius Caesar. It was a reform of the earlier Roman calendar, which was largely a lunar solar one. And for most of the period of the Common Era, New Year's Day was the 25th of March. In the Gregorian calendar is what the calendar that is now used in most parts of the world. And it went into effect in October of 1582, following the papal bull Inter Gravissimos, which was issued by Pope Gregory XIII. And that was introduced as a modification of and a replacement for the Julian calendar. And New Year's Day in that calendar was the 1st of January. So what happened in that transition? What you see on the left is what the calendar for October of 1582 looked like in many countries. The switch occurred on between the 4th of Thursday, the 4th of October, 1582. The next day was the 15th of October, 1582. So you think daylight savings time is difficult. So they basically dropped 10 days, and that's when they did it. So that's what the calendar looked like in many places. Because from that day until 1700, there was a difference of 10 days. There was a difference of 11 days from 1700 to 1800, 12 days difference from 1800 to 1900, 13-day difference from 1900 to 2100, and if you're still keeping track, from 2100 to 2200, there will be a 14-day difference between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. But looking at the various changes in 1582, many of the Catholic countries, because this was promulgated by the Pope, many of the Catholic countries went on board. So uh, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, a number of others. You'll note that the Protestant countries tended to be a bit later on this. So 1700, Denmark, Norway, some of the Protestant Swiss cantons, and then Great Britain, Ireland, and the so-called First British Empire, so British North America, changed in 1752, and that was as the result of the Calendar uh, New Style Act of 1750 under George II. There are some countries, however, even in the 20th century that switched. The Ottoman Empire in 1917, Russia in 1918, which is why, of course, the um, October Revolution took place in November. The November Revolution took place in October. Greece, the last one in 1923, the last European country, and Saudi Arabia in 2016. So what this means is that the date on which the Mayflower Compact was signed, what they put at the bottom was the 11th of November, 1620. That's in the Julian calendar. That is the 21st of November, 1620 in the Gregorian calendar, the calendar that we now use. And that's why I wanted to make sure that I talked about what happened with the signing of the Mayflower Compact exactly 400 years later, because somehow talking about it on the 11th of November in 2020, this is something that happened 399 years and 355 days ago, which doesn't have the same kind of punch as exactly 400 years ago. When the Mayflower actually arrived in Plymouth, it was the 16th of December, 1620. That was a Saturday. Because the 17th of November was a Sunday, they would not go on shore and start work because that was the Sabbath. So the Pilgrims didn't actually go on shore until the 18th of December. Now, the group that had originally come to Plymouth as they were looking for places to settle had been there sometime before. But the 16th of December, 1620 in the old style was the 26th of December, 1620 in the Gregorian calendar because of the 10-day difference. And 16th of March, 1620, we'll get to what happened on that day in a few minutes, was in the Gregorian calendar the 26th of March, but in 1621, because the year changed in the Julian calendar that was used in England on the 25th of March. So there not only is a change of date, there's a change of year for the first few months of each year. One of the things that I simply want to point out is that I used the Gregorian calendar all the way through. So in some cases, I point out that the date that the Pilgrims would use is going to be a different date than the date that we now use in the Gregorian calendar. But the first of those dates was the Mayflower Compact, one of certainly the iconic documents in the history of America, which was written and signed aboard the Mayflower in November of 1620. There it is on the right-hand side in William Bradford's handwriting. You can see he made a number of corrections there as well in his Journal of Plymouth Plantation. William Bradford's journal does not list signers. The first list of signers is in 1669. Nathaniel Morton, who was the Plymouth Colony secretary, listed signers uh, in his New England's memorial. And there they are there. The asterisks include the signers of the Mayflower Compact who died in the first year. But one of the intriguing things about all of this is who didn't sign, because we do have a list of all of the passengers. And what about the adult males who did not sign the Mayflower Compact? Here they are. There are 9 and possibly 10 of them. Um, Sometimes it's stated that these are people who were part of the crew and that they left and went back. But these are all people who stayed in Plymouth because they're in William Bradford's list in Plymouth Plantation. Well, at least most of them are. Master Lever is not mentioned by Bradford, but he's mentioned in Mort's relation. So that we know that he um, didn't, we don't really know what happened to him, but he's there, we know, in January of 16, what we would call 1621. And we know, for example, William Trevor is still in New England in 1650, so that he didn't go back. Roger Wilder was a servant of John Carver. He may have been under 21, and so it's unclear. So he may have been a 10th, but he did not sign. And again, the asterisks list those people who did not, those who died within the first year. There were 102 passengers of the Mayflower. One died and one was born. So 102 passengers arrived in Plymouth. It was just a different 102 than the one that left England. Of those, 74 were men, 28 were women. 41 adult men signed, that's 82%, and about half of them died in the first year. 9 adult men, or possibly 10, did not sign, that's 18%, and 5 of those died in the first year. So one of the questions is, what happened with them? Were they just simply, yeah, you fine, you people go ahead, you get your, you set up your compact, and we'll just stay over here, or they were just simply content to be governed without their consent. And so I still don't have an answer to that, because not all of these people went back to England or died. The other question is that there certainly appears that some of the people who signed were coerced into signing. And this is something that at this distance, we can't always tell about that, but that's another question. Um, how how free was this? And so, as I've said, I don't really have an answer for all of this, but just simply looking at it, it raises a lot of questions. There's also the kind of basic drama, and this is one of the things that you particularly realize when you are going day by day through all of this. By the time you hit February, reading each one of these, or as I was writing each one of these, you realize that they're there in Plymouth. They arrived there. The place had been cleared because the settlement of Patuxet had been there previously. So the Indians had cleared the land, so that was good. But they also talk about going through and seeing the skeletons, the bleached bones that were there, because they were not able to bury those who were there. So you basically are setting up your settlement in a graveyard, which you can see there. It's dark at night, so that when you look out, all you see is, there are people out there. You know that the natives are there and they can see you, but you can't see them. You have had no contact with any other human beings other than the people who were on the boat with you. And you have been with these people in very close quarters for 8 months. And you have not seen or spoken to anyone else. And you look out there at night and in a strange land, and just to think of the psychological um, effect of all of this is really amazing. You look out there, there are people out there, but you've not seen them or spoken to them. And then at the towards the end of March in 1621, there is, as Mort's relation describes it, and there it is in the original form in the left-hand corner. Samoset shows up. He walks, and he must have been an incredibly brave person. He walks in, as they describe it, completely naked, with arrows, with the arrowheads removed as a sign of peace. And he says the famous words, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. And so just thinking of what that must have felt like. This is the first person that you haven't been on the boat with in 8 months that you've seen. And he comes out of nowhere and he greets you in English. I mean, I don't know whether nobody actually described what their immediate psychological reaction was. I would not be surprised at all if it was complete and utter shock as this happened. But the drama of this meeting is particularly increased when you think about all of that time that these people have been together, thinking that they're alone, or at least realizing that they're very much alone. You can't just simply go down to the shop and pick up something that you left behind. And there is also, and then all of a sudden this happens, and many new vistas open up. But then the other major question, and I don't really have an answer to this quite yet, is why did the Plymouth colony fail? It and the New Haven colony were the two that had that failed. But why is it? Because one of the things that you really get when you read through Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, when you get to the second part, he picked up again later on, so that he wrote in about 1630 or so, he wrote the first part where they get to Plymouth and they set things up there. And then he picks up again a decade or so later and then writes the second half, and it's much, much darker. And this is, why is this? And why eventually in 1691 did the Plymouth colony fail? I think there are three sets of reasons. The first are economic reasons. The economy of Plymouth colony was based on fish, timber, fur, and agriculture. The colonists harvested trees for lumber, they hunted beaver and otter for their pelts, they fished for cod, not very successfully, and they also hunted whales for their oil. And they sent back all of the goods that they harvested on ships, and the Plymouth Company would sell the goods in England, presumably for a profit. The colonists struggled for many years to make any money. They were deeply in debt to their investors, the Plymouth Company, who had paid for the voyage and the startup money for the colony. The Plymouth Company initially invested between £1,200 and £1,600 in the colony, and that was before the Mayflower even sailed. Now, how much is that now? It depends. A simple purchasing power calculator would say that the relative value of that £1,600 in 1620 would be about £336,000 in 2020, or about $477,000 US in 2020. That's one way. That's if you use the retail price index. If you use the labor value, the difference in wages between 1620 and 2020, what you get is a much higher figure. So that the labor value would now be £4,648,000, which is $6,597,000. So that $6.5 million is what they were in debt. And that's before they even left. So the colonists eventually bought out the investors when these investors became unhappy with the lack of return, when they saw that it was just simply not coming back, their investment. But the problem was that the fur trade had almost disappeared by 1640. And for the next 20 years, only further decline ensued. So by the mid-1640s, the town of Plymouth was virtually a ghost town. And economically, the colony had become a backwater. In 1627, the Plymouth Company investors were unhappy with the lack of return that they saw from the colony, and the colonists then agreed to buy them out for £1,800. And that was to be paid in installments of £200 a year over the next 9 years. And so 8 colonists pledged their personal credit to buy the investors' shares. And those colonists were William Bradford, John Holland, Miles Standish, Isaac Allerton, Edward Winslow, William Brewster, John Alden, and Thomas Prince, who was a passenger on the Fortune but had arrived in 1621. So in reality, it actually took much longer than 9 years to pay back the money. And the Pilgrims didn't finish paying it off until 20 years later in 1648. The colony never became as economically successful as its northern neighbor, and it was merged with, or perhaps better, it was absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691. The government of Plymouth Colony originally ran as a charter government, even though it didn't actually have a charter from the crown, and it never did. The charter was official permission to establish a colony. It granted the colony the legal right to exist there, and it allowed it to establish a local government, as long as the colony's laws didn't contradict the laws of England. The only permission that the Plymouth colony had to establish itself in North America was a land patent that was issued by the New England Council in 1621. And that's it on the right-hand side of the screen there, the Pierce patent, which you can see if you go to Pilgrim Hall. It's been really remarkably preserved there. That land patent was renewed and revised in 1630. But this land patent didn't give the colony the legal right to establish laws in the colony. Plymouth Colony tried for many decades to obtain a charter from the Crown, but it never succeeded. It eventually lost the right to self-govern entirely when it was merged with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691, and it became a royal colony. Legal historians have stated that there were no lawyers in the colony. That, of course, is another sign of failure. But there were no lawyers in that colony through the 17th century. However, by 1680, the limit on the fees they could receive, acquainted with, or at least the general court was sufficiently acquainted with attorneys that they could bring in to enact a limit on the fees that they could receive in any case. And the limit was 5 shillings. Another reason probably why they didn't have any lawyers, because it really didn't pay. The governor and the assistants operated through the Court of Assistants, also called the council. They operated to handle all matters on a subject-by-subject and a case-by-case basis. They didn't have the authority to enact comprehensive laws and ordinances. And rather, they just simply issued orders on a limited array of subjects through the Court of Assistants. Only the General Court, which was attended by voting freemen, had the authority to enact that legislation, and it didn't do that in a comprehensive manner until the codification of laws in 1636. And that only lasted for a bit over 50 years. And so probably the cruelest failure of all was the religious failure. And that requires a bit more detail than the other ones. But the religious failure of the Plymouth colony can be summarized under 3 headings. The first is the impossibility of separatism. Now, we've been programmed to see the Pilgrims as self-consciously working for religious freedom, and that in its 20th or 21st century sense. And this makes 2 assumptions, which are questionable at best and erroneous at worst. And the first assumption that makes is that conscience in general and religion in particular is a matter of private or personal opinion. And while that is certainly what modern secular and civil authority contends, or perhaps assumes, in the 16th century, religion had a political and cultural and quite definitely a public character. And public activity definitely had a religious character. So we use terms such as separation of church and state or theocracy, but neither of those is really appropriate or applicable to 17th century Plymouth. That would be looking at the colony with an exceptionally 20th century spin. And the second problem with this is that the Church of England was the only English institution that was in every single community in England. Neither the state nor the military had, or indeed even today, has the same or as widespread a presence in England. So to withdraw from the Church of England of necessity meant that one had to withdraw from England. And as the Pilgrims noted, and in case they forgot, they were reminded by James I, the conclusion that the Church of England was not a true church inevitably entailed the conclusion that the King of England was not a true king. And that was treason. And this is seen even more clearly in the treatment of Roman Catholic recusants. No one in England was ever executed simply for being a Roman Catholic. Catholics were executed for treason, for which the normal form of execution was being hung, drawn, and quartered, since that offense was in the highest degree odious. Because Pius V, in his bull, Regnans in Excelsis, on the 25th of February, 1570, which excommunicated Elizabeth I, explicitly demanded that all Catholics in England rise up and overthrow the government, even calling on them to kill the Queen. He put English Catholics in a completely untenable situation. They had to choose between loyalty to their church, which was treason, or loyalty to England, which was heresy. Both entailed death, either in this life or in the life to come. So, in a real sense, the principal desire of the Pilgrims was to be left alone, to live outside of both church and state. And that is not viable, nor is it even really particularly attractive. The Plymouth colony was also woefully unable to attract any clergymen to minister to them, and thus they almost completely lacked religious leadership in America. Those clergy that came were either Anglicans, shudder, I mean, that's what they traveled thousands of miles to get away from, or in a slightly later period, clergy from Massachusetts Bay, particularly products of the newly established Harvard College, who were not really in line with the religious tenets that the Pilgrims held so dear, both close to their hearts and at such a cost. And this is connected with the fact that Plymouth was never really able to attract settlers in large numbers. And this is all the more obvious when compared with the experience north of the provincial line in Boston, which had thousands of people arriving by the boatload. It's been noted more than once that the diffidence of Plymouth colony in not persecuting Quakers had everything to do with Quakers not wanting to settle there. There were Quakers, particularly around Sandwich on Cape Cod, but never in very significant numbers, and Plymouth couldn't afford to lose even the few people that they had. And finally, separatism could only work if the whole community was united, as the Acts of the Apostles relates of the early Christian community. And as idealized as Acts 2 is for the early church, the Pilgrims consciously sought to imitate it 16 centuries later. Now, much has been made of the tension between the saints and the strangers, but it has to be noted that the strangers, with only a handful of exceptions, were willing to go along with the saints and to conform to their activities and their way of life for the colony to survive. If they weren't willing to do that, then they wouldn't have made such a dangerous voyage in the first place. Bradford's very, very dark description of the disintegration of religious life in the community, or perhaps more accurately, simply the entropy of the community, highlights that he thought that the greatest and the gravest failure of Plymouth was not economic nor political, as serious as those failures were, but religious. But he took courage from the fact that at least they tried. So those are some of the things that immediately come out from um, this whole project. Um, it was originally put up on the website for the Canadian Society of Mayflower Descendants and the North Carolina Society of Mayflower Descendants and Soul Kindred in America. And it has now been published all together as a book under the title Mayflower Day by Day. And it's available for from Heritage Books in Berwyn Heights, Maryland. The um, website there is heritagebooks.com. It's also available from uh, Alden Kindred at the Alden House. And I just simply want to point out that the royalties from this book are going to Pilgrim Hall as part of their project or their many ongoing projects. Um, and so if you're interested in more of these, because there's a lot of other things that came up, then you can read all of them there. So that's that. So back to you, Desiree.
Yes, thank you so much, Beckett. That was really fascinating. A couple questions and some that were posted in the registration when people signed up. And that was just when you were researching this and approaching it, on this sort of calendar year, sort of stories that you hadn't really realized, or, people, some of the passengers that really struck you in a way that you hadn't really noticed before.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is trying to come up with something every day. So, particularly the voyage over. All right, okay, I've already written about how they steered, and I've written about what they had, and what else do you have? But things like, for example, what animals are there? Everybody talks about the two dogs, but then you know, chickens were there, so that when Edward Winslow visits Massasoit, and Massasoit is ill, and I just laughed when we read that Edward Winslow immediately sent a messenger back to Plymouth saying, in effect, chicken soup, stat. Uh, and so they brought back chicken soup. They also brought back a chicken, which uh, the natives didn't have. Um, so that I think one of the big things is the interplay between the natives and the pilgrims. A lot is made of the fact that if it weren't for the natives, that the pilgrims would not have survived. And that's true. But it's also true that if it weren't for the pilgrims, the natives would have been wiped out. Because, for example, the Narragansetts are attacking the Pokanoket Indians, and one of the things that really enabled Massasoit to um, survive is the fact that he could always threaten them with um, with the new kids on the block there, and that is so you see that it was, and even for example in the first Thanksgiving, they show up. Massasoit shows up with 90 uh, of the warriors. So these are all men. Now they do bring a number of deer, so that's a great hostess gift. But you've only got four married women who are doing all of the cooking. So yeah, I mean, you think you have it bad, and that this is probably not a friendly visit. I mean, it's not a hostile visit, but when you show up with troops there, something else may be going on, and so trying to kind of work through that. So these are some of the things that kind of came from, not that I didn't know about these things before, but from a second look as you're going through it really, kind of in real time and more closely looking at them.
So you do spend a little bit of time on the Christopher Jones controversy and, how, whether or not he deliberately sort of got them off track. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's conspiracy theory, I think is what we would call it now.
Mhm.
So one of the questions is that it's very clear that they were intending, even in the Mayflower Compact, it talks about the northern part of Virginia, and that they were headed for um, the mouth of the Hudson River, I think is what we would now uh, call. And um, they are too far north of that when they hit Cape Cod. They then start heading south, but they find out that it's a bit too dangerous. They've also been on the Mayflower for quite some time. They are starting to run out of things like beer. You didn't have water because water could go bad, and so but at least beer could be preserved. And so at one point, um, Christopher Jones decides, no, we're not going to go around the outside. We're going to stay here in Cape Cod or in that vicinity. And so the question is, was that intentional? I mean, did he go too far north um, in order to just basically dump them and then head back? Um, that there is, I mean, there is nothing, there's no smoking gun in this. Uh, so that there's no like kind of letter in which he writes back and says, "Yeah, sorry, I felt sorry for them," and so I. The other thing, of course, is that he stayed and the crew, and they lost a significant part of the crew in that first winter, so that they left in April of 1621. Uh, so, I mean, is there that there are things that point towards the fact that they were because that they were just simply going to be dumped someplace. Um, and then there are other things that suggest that this is probably unlikely uh, in that case. But the because the other thing, of course, is recall that when the first one of the first times that they attempted to leave England, they were turned in to the authorities before they left England by the ship's captain. And so uh, they are they haven't had very good results with their transportation plans. And so um, nothing is stated either in the Plymouth Company or the um, or by um, the Pilgrims themselves, but a lot of this is reading between the lines.
So a question about the Quakers. I think the sort of the sense that you get about them today is, it's a very peaceful um, group. But back in that day, the question was, why were they so controversial?
Well, I mean, a number of reasons. One is that a lot of the things that we take for granted with the functioning of the community, the Quakers did not participate. For example, did not participate in. For example, they didn't take oaths, which meant that they were outside of the legal system there. That their recognition of authority uh, was limited. That they did not. Um, they lived by their own rules, and so this was um, in addition to having um, uh, some religiously distinct opinions. Not so much talking about the Um, I think that there were the religious differences, and then there were the social differences. Social differences in that period also meaning legal differences and governmental differences. Um, it wasn't so much of a problem. It wasn't as much of a problem in Plymouth as it was in Massachusetts Bay, simply because there were a lot more Quakers in Massachusetts Bay than there were in Plymouth. There was a large group down by Sandwich, and by the end of the 17th century, the Dartmouth uh, near New Bedford, uh, the Dartmouth monthly meeting was also large. Large numbers of souls were there, and some uh, so that was but it was dealt with somewhat differently. There was the best I could describe it as diffidence. So it was not outright hostility, but they were never really accepted either. They were just kind of left alone in Plymouth. And then once Plymouth was uh, uh, assumed into Massachusetts Bay, then things spread out a bit more.
So there's also interest in the focus or your point about this group of non-signers and can so to sign an English to sign a document for the English, what were sort of some of the rule things that would be in play, like a certain age, obviously would be male. What would be some of the other things that would govern that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that uh, well, I mean, first is looking at the language of the Mayflower Compact, which is almost word for word from some of the sermons of John Calvin in the 1550s and 1560s, which certainly the uh, the Pilgrims would have known. Um, and so the idea of a civil body politic and this language is coming directly out of the foundations of Geneva. So, I mean, I think they they are looking and they see that they're in a strange land. Um, they don't really know where they are. They have no authority there. There is no government. There is no place that they can go, and they've got people who are making trouble. I mean, that's probably the nicest way that we can interpret what William Bradford describes there as the reason for this. And so they do two things. One is they have this before they've even gone on shore in Provincetown. They sign this document. I think you can make a case that they had actually drafted this before they left. I mean, we don't know, but that's one possibility. So signing that says, okay, I'm going to, you know, what you agree on, I'm going to, you know, I want to be part of this. Um, the other thing with it uh, is that I think that there is it's parallel to the kind of covenant that starts a religious congregation, and so um, the I think that they would have been aware of these kind of documents because this kind of documents frequently was used in the foundation of religious congregations. And so signing that is saying, yeah, this is what I believe. So I'm committing myself to this. Now, the people who did not sign, some of them, for example, I mean, particularly if John Carver's servant was an adult and didn't sign. Um, so it's unclear whether or not these are all to use the language strangers, or whether some of them are also attached to it. So nobody who did not sign said why they didn't. And sometimes people are, you find people giving ideas. Well, maybe they were all under the age of 21, because really your signature only had legal effect after 21, because before that, you had a guardian who could act for you. But once you were 21, your signature had a legal effect. And so that's why the assumption is that these are all over the age of 21. Um, so sometimes there is an assumption. It's nowhere stated that everybody signed, all the adult males signed. So the assumption that some people had is that all males signed. Like, these people may, however, have been they wanted to go back to England immediately, or they um, were going to, or they were sick, or maybe they were illiterate and couldn't sign their names, um, but they didn't even make a mark in that case. So that and the fact that it's a significant number. I mean, it's coming up on 20% of the group, and none of them left a reason. And some of them are still there in 1650. So it's not that they all went back or died. Um, and so I think part of it is that the Mayflower Compact had a religious component to it, and that it was an emergency uh, response to being somewhere where they had no authority. And we've got to do something. And so let's all covenant together using what they were familiar with from their religious congregation.
So I think we're getting close to our time here. I want to be respectful of everyone's lunch hour or wherever else your day will find itself. So if there are any last questions, please just go ahead and post them. Otherwise, again, I want to mention that Becket's wonderful book, Mayflower Day by Day, is available through Heritage Books and the Alden House, as is his book about the fortune, if any of your family happen to come over on that ship as well. So we want to wish everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you're in the Duxbury area, please visit us. We are open right now for private tours through mid-December, and look forward to welcoming everyone back to the museum in 2026 and with the opening of our new Alden Center for Living History. So exciting news ahead. Becket, thank you so much for this fabulous talk. And again, happy Thanksgiving to everyone. So we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you.